Functions are reusable code. A function allows you to store code under a specific name and then execute that code at a later time. A function always starts with the function keyword, and this is followed by the name of the function with parentheses and then opening and closing curly braces which wrap our function code. So let's define a function called greeting, and then we have our opening and closing parentheses, and now we have our opening and closing curly braces. And simply this function will echo hello, nice to meet you. Right, so now in order to use this function, we simply type the name of the function along with the parentheses and close with our semicolon. Now let's save this. Let's refresh our directory and let's start up our functions file. Right, so now we see here that we get hello and nice to meet you. So no matter how many times we call this function will be available for us, right? So we get it as many times as we decide to call it. So let us modify this function a little bit. Let us add some parentheses and let us simply add first name. And inside our function, let us now concat our first name. And actually we do not have to do this. We can just use interpolation and say first name. Hello, first name, and nice to meet you. And you can achieve this with using the double quotations as mentioned in one of our previous lessons. So now, when we call our function, now that we have a parameter, we have to give our function call a parameter once we call our function. If we save this and try running it without giving it a parameter, we get a fatal error, uncaught argument, too few arguments in our function greeting. 0 parameters were passed. Right, so we have to give our function a parameter. So let us pass in our first name, and it's a string. So let us say, let us pass in a name, and let us save this, and let us refresh, and we get hello and the name we passed in, nice to meet you. So this is how we can add parameters to our function. And to add additional parameters, we simply have to separate them with a comma. So we can say first name, last name. And in our function call, we simply separate them by a comma. And let's add our last name. And inside our function, let us also add the last name. So when we save this and run it, we get hello Vanessa Wilkins, nice to meet you. So this is how we would deal with multiple parameters using PHP. Right, so functions can be used as utility tools also. So let us have a function. Let's define one called capitalize. And this will take a string value. And I am going to use the return keyword. And I am going to use a built-in function called mb.toUpper. String to upper, and then pass in our value. So whatever value I give to this capitalized function, it will always return it in an upper string. So let me now define a variable called pet, and inside pet I'm going to do a function call capitalize, and this is a string, so let us say Sparky, and now let us echo Sparky. So we would have to echo our pet. So let us save this. So let me comment out this function call for our greeting method. So the reason we are having to echo our pet variable is because inside our function we are using the return keyword, right? So we can see here it is called from within a function, and it immediately ends the execution of the current function and returns its value in the function call. So the value that is returned by our capitalized function needs to be stored inside a variable, and then we can echo the value of that variable. So let us save this and refresh our page, and we see that it has printed our string value and basically changed it to uppercase. All right, so that's a nice utility function that we can use. If we need to capitalize any strings, we can always do it this way. All right, let's take a look at another simple function. So let us call this one. So let us define a function and call it sum, and we can set sum equal to a function. So let's say sum is equal to function, and let's say num1 and num2, and now we can simply inside our function say return num1 plus num2. Now let us echo and call our function, and now let's pass in two numbers to be added. So let us pass in 12 and 6. Let's save this and run it. Okay, we get a syntax error, unexpected token echo, line 28. So this is line 28. Okay, so I believe we should end this with a semicolon. Let me test this. Okay. All right, so let's check and see what's causing this error. All right, so here, and I believe I see what the error is. So I need, since we're defining a function and storing it inside a variable, I will need to essentially put that variable and do the function call like this. So let me save it now and do a refresh, and we get our value. So let me comment this capitalized function call out. So I want to explain this a little bit more. So this is what is known as a closure. So it's a nameless function or closure, and basically closures can be stored in variables or passed into other functions. So this is essentially how we would define a closure. And remember, when we define functions this way, I believe we have to have the semicolon after the closing curly brace. If we don't, and we try to run this, we will get a parse error. Okay, so when we see a syntax unexpected token echo like this, and it's pointing us to line 30, but once we look at our line 30, we realize that this syntax looks okay. So the key thing to do is look at the previous line, and we realize, okay, this is where the error must be. All right, so remember, keep that in mind. If it's a regular function like our greeting or capitalized function, we do not need to have a semicolon after the closing curly brace. If it is a nameless function or closure, and we are defining it by storing it inside a variable, then we have to do two things. Have the semicolon at the end, or at the closing curly brace, and also have use our variable in the function call. Right, so these are two things that we have to keep in mind. Ensure that you're using this $ and the name of the variable when you do your function call. All right, so let us modify this function a little bit. There are ways to add default values to our parentheses or to our parameters. So for instance, if we wanted to set num1 equal to a default value of 2 and set num2 to a default value of 3, then we could do a function call without passing in any parameters. So now let us save this, and we should get the sum of 2 and 3, which is 5. So if we only want to have to pass in one variable or no variables into our parameters rather into our function, then this is one way we can do so, by passing in default values. If I only wanted to have one default value, num2 set to 3, then inside the parentheses for my sum function, I could only enter one value, which is 9. So then this would give us the result of 9, which would be stored in num1 plus 3. So let's check that out. So we get 12. And essentially, the last thing, so we've looked at 2 values being set, and we've looked at 1 value being set. If we want to overwrite the value in num2 with our own value, we can still use our comma and add another value, let's say 10, and this second value would overwrite the 3 that is stored in num2. So if we save this and run it, we should get the value 19, which is 9 plus 10, because the 10 has overwritten the value of num2. So in a nutshell, this is how you declare functions and use them in PHP.